Our first session this morning, it's an ode to what GST stands for in its entirety. A deep-rooted focus on valuing how relevant it is to stay global, connected, and engage in meaningful conversations. Our keynote speaker this morning is Professor Raja Mohan, an Indian academic, journalist, and foreign policy analyst, a revered expert in South Asia, currently a visiting faculty at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Besides being the founding director at Carnegie, India, and a distinguished fellow at Observer Research Foundation, he also held the chair at the Henry Kissinger Scholar in the John W. Klug Center, DC, from 2009 to 10. Let's listen in as he gives us global perspective for India. In conversation with him a little bit later would be Vice Admiral Anil Chopra, who holds the unique distinction of having been the Commander-in-Chief of both the Western and Eastern Combat Command of the Indian Navy and the Director General of the Indian Coast Guard. Admiral Chopra has been awarded the Param Vishesh Seva and Ati Vishesh Seva Medal for his service and has been an advisor to the NSA and the Apex Defense Council. I seek forgiveness if I didn't introduce you right, sir. It is hard to introduce both of you. So please, may we begin, sir. We call you on stage. Thank you.
Good morning, and it's wonderful to be with all of you here. I know I spend a lot of time in hotel rooms, largely on the conference circuit around the world. But I always wondered, how do people run these kind of institutions? Just thinking from a public-facing point of view, 24/7 electricity, water, linen, internet, of course, these days, and dealing with kind of thousands of people are going in and out, and a lot of crazies included among them. To be able to run this kind of, with apologies to Admiral Chopra, I think it's even more demanding than a military, to be able to run with precision, with where you have so many factors interceding and being able to run it. At least armies have peace times, but a hotel, there is no peace time. It's 24/7. To be able to deal with the public and to make everything run is really a challenge. So it's always impressed me. So it's wonderful to be here with some of the geniuses who make it happen. So it's, for me, first time actually interacting with the people who actually run hotels. It's one thing to run a complex operation like a hotel, that to large hotels, but also, as we've heard, to run it to exacting high standards. I think that is even a more challenging thing, and to be able to sustain those kind of standards over a long period and maintain a reputation is quite something. Even more important, I thought, to be able to run such an excellent operation in a developing country, in a cities where in India, where the environment is far more demanding than running a hotel in the Western world or the developed world. So that takes even more skill, and I think, and more, intellect, more capacity to actually manage this high-standard hospitality institutions in countries like ours. So it's really a privilege to interact with all of you. Just from what I heard about the school, Oberoi School is almost like the Indian Express, where I write for. Almost most journalists in India would have gone through the Indian Express. In a way, it was a training ground. We don't have the kind of luxury, but it's really where you learned the art of journalism, to be able to do things under great pressure and to be able to deliver on a daily basis. So that's, again, something I hope we have in common. Now, speaking about peacetime and wartime, really today, we are really in a wartime. This is where the world is headed today, and where the world is in today. Just when we thought we had come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are now into the Ukraine war. It's almost 2.5 years since then. We had thought war is largely over in the developed world, and that Europe, which had seen peace since the Second World War, would be in the middle of a fairly brutal war, a war in which really you have actually cities being destroyed on a daily basis by one side or the other. Second, we also seen, by the time we kind of coped, we still not coped with the Ukraine war. You are into the Gaza crisis, the Gaza war, which again, these two wars, they're not only, wars in the particular regions, but the effects on the rest of the world are quite deep. I didn't learn that Ukraine was a major grain producer in the world, and that something that happens to Ukraine and its Black Sea coast has a huge impact on the global, food markets. Middle East, of course, we know the oil and what a small bunch of Houthis in Yemen can do to the global supply chains running through the Red Sea. It tells you that in this interdependent world, the conflict is back, and my fear is that these two conflicts that we're seeing now today in Europe and in the Middle East, they might look like picnics if China does invade Taiwan, and the kind of response that the US might make. So here, what you have is really, unlike in Ukraine, where the US is not directly participating in the conflict, in Taiwan, if it happens, there's going to be a real direct confrontation between the US and China, world's two largest economies, the world's two largest military powers, which is going to really shake the world to its core. Hopefully, we'll prevent that. We will not see that conflict, but what we are seeing today is, after nearly 40 years of relative harmony among the major powers, we are into an era of deep conflict, new coalitions being built. You have Russia and China coming together. You have the US putting together its NATO allies. So therefore, you're going to see a congealing of this conflict between the major powers, which will have a profound effect on the rest of the world. So we are just at the beginning of this conflict, and this conflict, like many of us who grew up in the Cold War, it is an all-encompassing one, and no sphere of human life is going to be left untouched. We're already seeing some of that. For example, that brings me to the larger question that unlike the Soviet Union, which was not a major economy, that Soviet Union opted out voluntarily from an economic competition with the West. It had its own economic systems with this little Eastern Europe and others, and it did not. There was very little commerce between Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. But today, China is deeply integrated into the world economy. It's the second largest economy. 30% of the world's manufacturing takes place in China. Therefore, China is also a major producer of technologies, and much of the goods that we rely on, and even some of the emerging sectors, like you have the electric vehicles, solar panels. In all these, actually, the Chinese domination has been quite dramatic. So what does this conflict do between the major powers? How it shapes the international system in the coming years will have a direct bearing on many walks of all spheres of human activity, including your own business, which Mr. Oberoi was telling me outside is probably the most sensitive to global turbulence, and that to conflict, whether it is interstate war or it is terrorism or it is subconventional conflict. The hotels are the ones that get caught in this, and also will to recover from the damages that wars do is going to be quite hectic. The second feature, I would say, in the world today is really, just as we assume that for 30 years, US, China, America, China, Russia, Japan, everybody was friends with each other. There was no really conflict. But what we're seeing today is really they're beginning to form blocks, and the contestation between them is going to grow. A second linked aspect to this is the nature of globalization. All of us, in India, we came of age in the 90s when India ended its isolation and joined the stream of globalization in the world. And we also assume that the logic of globalization and interdependence that was being built in the 1990s was going to be a permanent feature of the world system. That globalization is not reversible, is immutable, and that all of us are going to work with the system where the economic interdependence is only going to deepen. That it seemed that it did not really matter where goods were produced, as long as you could produce them with efficiency, at a lower cost. That's what seemed to matter, and the supply chains and the trade routes, that as long as they functioned all right, the world was going to be in a different place. The assumption was that efficiency would set the terms for the global distribution of economic activity, and that the logic of efficiency is going to bring us all together, and everyone is going to benefit from this happy world of interdependence and integration of the world economies. What we've seen in the last decade or so is really a shattering of this illusion, if you will. Partly the pandemic showed us that whether it's getting mass, whether it's getting even the simplest things, the dependence on one geography, one country in particular was going to create huge problems. And therefore, the need to shift away from efficiency to resiliency, that it's not just enough to deliver, to produce goods according to the best place on the base of efficiency, but resilience, that you should also be able to deal with crisis, that you would not be tied down to one place of production in the event of a major crisis like the pandemic. That lesson, therefore, I think, has compelled most of the major economies to rethink how they approach the logic of economic globalization and trade beyond borders. The second assumption that of the economic side that has come unstuck is the notion that everybody benefits from globalization. Now, what the politics in the US has told us in the last few years, and before that in the Brexit, in the British elections in 2016, not everybody benefits equally. Even the best possible system was not going to see equal benefits, or the assumption that benefits can filter down to everyone. So one of the great consequences of economic globalization in the US, for example, that you had large towns, communities which were dependent on production, manufacturing. For example, those of you who travel to the Chicago or the Midwestern area, which were great auto towns. But in the last 20 years, once the NAFTA came in, China got into the WTO in 2001, what you had was a decimation of large parts of human settlements, because you said capital was only interested in efficiency. If I can produce it cheaper in China, if I can produce it cheaper in Mexico, I take my factory out and go. Now, the backlash to that was what President Trump, or candidate Trump, mobilized in 2016. And posed the question, are we mere economic beings devoted to efficiency? Or we're also communities? That if you're a factory town in Illinois or in Ohio, that are you a community of people working together? Are you just there as economic beings serving the interests of the larger capital? That question, that's the reason why you see a Republican Party that wore yellow ties, a country club, the rich guys party, is today championing the workers, those who've been dispossessed in the United States. And that has unleashed a dramatic earthquake in the nature of the global economic systems. For years, we complained that Americans are imposing globalization on us. Look at them. That used to be the argument in India. They're forcing us to do these things. But actually, India has been a major beneficiary of globalization. But the losers in the West from the process of globalization, especially the working people, those who are doing manufacturing sector, and today, those people have been mobilized in the US, and a small, just the location in a few states in the US, there might be 7 or 8 swing states, which are old industrial rust belt, if you will, are they going to determine the outcomes of the political victories in the United States? So therefore, the pressure from those who are dispossessed, the losers of globalization in the West, because we always talked about losers in the developing world, but actually the losers within the West are today exerting great pressure to rearrange this structure. So therefore, this notion of free trade is yielding place to fair trade. The notion that, look, you go to the cheapest place where you can get labor. Today, the question of workers' rights, environmental rights, standards of, for example, what you produce with relative cheap, an Indian steel produced with cheap labor is going to invite sanctions. Or the Europeans, of course, are saying the carbon intensity of your steel production is going to decide whether I let you into my market or not. So in many ways, I think that this idea that everyone would simply trade without any political conditions, that system is broken down, and we are today into a fundamental rearrangement of the global economic system. And within this, a third policy change that has taken place is the industrial policy. That is, we all said, look, let capital do what it wants. That we all assumed that the state had no role in the new globalized era. But what we've seen happen in the last few years is the state is back. The state is back in a big way. The US, for example, where the role of the state has been the least in the economic activity, today has passed at least 3 major acts: the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't go by the names, but all of them are actually about reclaiming American primacy in technology. Take the leadership in technology, because all these years it didn't seem to matter American capital investing in Chinese small firms or Chinese digital firms and say, look, that was producing enough returns. But now you're saying no. TSMC in Taiwan has to produce in Arizona. That is, you're not going to just let one country or 2 countries produce vital components of the modern economy, and they need to be brought back to the United States. So therefore, they're giving incentives, subsidies to win the advanced industries back into the United States, and we're just at the beginning of the process. We've also seen in India, which did not sign the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in Asia, supposed to be in a free trade agreement, and it's also today the so-called PLI scheme, the production-linked incentive scheme of actually encouraging manufacturing in India. We've seen some success in the case of iPhones, where the Apple is producing and shifting some of its chains from China to India. So therefore, the relocation of technological production, industrial production is going to take place on scale, driven by the states, government's policies, which are today locked in a geopolitical conflict. So geopolitical conflict, accompanied by geoeconomics, is today producing fundamental changes in the way we think about the global economy and global security. There's a third feature, and I would just refer to the question of technology. We've been talking about technology already. That we are in the middle of a great technological revolution, whether it is the artificial intelligence, semiconductors, bio. In fact, that is just a beginning, and you're going to see a lot of activity in the so-called bioeconomy, where we're going to use molecular biology to change a lot of the economic production that we've been doing in the past. Outer space, is going to be a major zone for economic activity. So the new areas which are coming in, so the mobilization of national resources to be able to shape and control these emerging technologies, that is a huge challenge, and I think we're going to see a lot of that unfolding. Every day we see US and China actually, they're at the top of this curve, but others like India, Europe, and others are also going to be part of it. So there were 3 levels of conflict: geopolitical conflict, restructuring of the economic globalization, and the domination of emerging technology. So these are the 3 broad areas that we're going to see. So I'll just conclude by referring to India. How does India fit into this? On the first level, today we are closer to the US and the West than ever before. Whatever the government says publicly, your trade, those of you dealing in the hospitality industry, Indians are not going in droves to Russia for tourism. If you see, go to the VFS, it's a chock-a-block. You can't get into that building. That the nature of India's commerce, its technological linkages, its business today is increasingly with the West. But at the same time, India's historic relationship with Russia has put us in a bind of how do we deal with the conflict in Ukraine. And if the conflict between Russia and China on the one hand, and US and Europe and Japan on the other, as that conflict gets deeper, then the question of how we deal with it is going to be a big challenge. The second aspect, I think, on the economic side, India's attempt to reposition itself in this world of geoeconomics, which meant reducing or de-risking some of our relationship with China, You can't do it automatically. You can't do it overnight. Trade is growing with China, but at least in some advanced areas like 5G, 6G, we're beginning to try to produce our own stuff so that you're not only dependent on China. Because if you look at 2G, 3G expansion was done entirely with the cheap Chinese components of Huawei and ZTE, but today you're trying to do it on your own. And the third aspect is that even on the technological development today, you have Bangalore and Silicon Valley tied at the hip. So for all the limitations that we have in our relationship with the US, that the US is going to be a principal partner in the production of technologies. And that in turn is reinforced once again by the fact that US and China are at loggerheads. India and China are also at loggerheads. That has produced a convergence today. We don't say how long this will last, but for the near term, at least for the foreseeable future, both these conflicts seem difficult to overcome, and that puts India and the West, India and the US very, very close. So I'll just close with this thought that as you look at our debates, we all desperate for American endorsement, American pat on the back, but at the same time, you're also very thin-skinned. Some editorial in New York Times will make you go crazy. I mean, you see all the YouTubers going crazy with the comments. But the fact is, I think there will be much greater scrutiny of India on the international system as you grow, as you become the third largest economy. The rest of the world is going to pay attention, whether your investment climate, your business climate, or your social climate, or your domestic politics. But this is something India ought to be prepared for. Maybe we are not fully prepared, but this is the challenge that comes to us. In a changing world, India is also changing. India is rising in the hierarchy of this international system. So how a changing India relates to a dramatically restructured world, that is the period ahead of us. And this period is going to be an exciting one that's going to demand a lot from us, all of us within India. But it's really, we are in for a great ride. And I'll stop here, maybe look for the conversation.
Is the mic on? Okay. I'm sure you'll all agree that in the short time available to Dr. Mohan, he gave us an excellent perspective of global dynamics and current geopolitical realities. Now, clearly, we live in interesting times, which I'm informed is a Chinese curse. In a world which is fragmenting and progressively using violence to sort out its affairs, very volatile. The faith in international institutions like the United Nations is dissolving. The promise of peace through economic integration and globalization is fading. We are far from an end of history. And today we see, as Raja pointed out, conventional wars raging in Europe, in West Asia, and tension in the Indo-Pacific. In short, we have much to talk about, but the constraints of time will allow us to only touch upon a couple of issues. So let me get on with that. The first, Raja, is the balance of power. The world managed quite well with the bipolar Cold War situation. Why shouldn't it be able to do the same with what is the bipolar world today, which is the US, the West, and some of its Asian allies on one side, and China, Russia, and maybe Iran on the other? For after all, mutually assured destruction still exists. So why are we so scared despite China's economic integration?
I think what's happened is the difference between the Cold War, where the bipolarity largely worked, because they were, at least in the economic sphere, there was very little interconnection between the two. But today, China is threatening the US in two fundamental ways. It wants to overthrow the US dominance in a number of technological areas. And though it has grown with the US support and help, today it sees its moment in the sun has come. Therefore, it's not going to take a secondary place and wants to be at least an equal, if not a number one in the international system. A second thing that the Chinese are doing is trying to move the Americans out of Asia. There's an old saying from Mao Zedong, who's supposed to have told the Americans, look, I don't know those of you familiar with the 1950s. I mean, the Americans, forces used to operate very close to the Chinese, Communist China's border. So Mao was supposed to have said, Americans are snoring next to my bed. Right now we can't do anything about it. We have to live with this snoring. But someday, sir, I'm going to tell you, would you like to move out a little bit? You're disturbing my sleep. I think Chinese have arrived at that position to say Americans, look, why don't you go home? I'll take care of this place. You don't need to worry. So you are here, you're buzzing in front of my front yard, if you will. I'm not liking it, so why don't you move? So I think the Chinese are fundamentally threatening the American position, both on the economic side and on the geopolitical side. And I think this alliance with Soviet Russia actually sharpens that problem.
So having said that, could you think there could be accommodation between the US and China as far as Asia is concerned? Do you see a kind of P2 agreement which is possible in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Americans and Chinese had such a great relationship for 40 years. I mean, we used to talk about Chimerica and American capital, Chinese market. I mean, it's like a marriage made in heaven. But yet, we saw that collapse in the last decade, because as long as Deng Xiaoping and his successors largely felt, look, keep your head down, don't take leadership, don't challenge the international system, it worked very well. But now Xi Jinping is impatient, and he thinks China can't keep its head down, that it must assert itself. And I think that has produced a contradiction. And that I don't see it being resolved in the near term. Every day you see the US Congress imposing another set of sanctions. Last week, there was a whole range of things on new technologies like AI, algorithms. So that I think that process is continuing. So the reconciliation will be difficult. But in abstract, you could argue the distant power and the local hegemon can come to some kind of a deal. But the problem is this, because the US cedes Asia and the Indo-Pacific, then its position in the international system falls apart. So I think, while Americans might be declining in some sense, but not so fast. So they're saying, we're still around, we're not going to cede our number one place so easily. So I think that makes it an irreconcilable contradiction in the near term.
Yeah, I would agree with you. If the US is not a Pacific power, it's no longer a global power.
Yeah.
But given the realities of weapons of mass destruction, however assertive Xi Jinping is, don't you think there's a line that he will not cross? Or put it another way, on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you see Taiwan taking place from your own point of view?
My sense is he will keep rattling the cage, hoping that, like good Chinese saying, you win wars not by using force, but by the very threat of use of force. So he's mounting pressure, on a consistent basis against Taiwan. And China has multiple means of intervening in the domestic politics of Taiwan. So they'll keep trying that. But in the end, the ambition is to get the Americans to say, look, Taiwan doesn't matter to us. But by his actions, actually, he's forced the US to say, no, we're not going to abandon Taiwan. We're going to support them. And in fact, last 2 years, there's a dramatic expansion of American military presence, equipment, and I think this has set the stage for a conflict. So I would say prospects for a war are not imminent, but the potential consequences are very, very high. So you could say even if it's a low risk, it's high consequences of potential conflict between the two of them.
Okay, let us move on from the big two to the multipolarity business. Many countries, including India, see a multipolar world with alternative nodes. Is this realistic? We have seen that the only thing that has really worked in the world historically, either a balance of power or a hegemon who controls everything. So multipolarity in its essence, is it workable? Who will lay the rules? Who will lay the standards? And would there not be in this interconnected world a great amount of chaos?
No, the multipolar world is a hope, it's an aspiration, it's not a reality. That it is true that a lot of new powers have risen, including India to some extent, China, of course. But the rise of the new powers, just to give an example, as late as 1997, 98, when Tony Blair became the Prime Minister of UK, UK's GDP was more than India and China combined. So that was the world just less than 30 years ago, where The Western domination was so palpable. And now you have, if you go to the top 10 economies, the number of non-Western economies, including India, Indonesia, Brazil, a whole lot of new economies are coming to the fore. So in that sense, there is a change in the distribution of power. Here is my case. I mean, that doesn't necessarily make the world a multipolar world. Because the US is hanging on to 25% of the global GDP.
Yeah.
So it's not the US that has declined, but actually Asia has grown, or Asian powers have grown, or non-Western powers have grown at the expense of Europe and Japan rather than at the expense of the United States. So in some sense, the US remains the number one power on the economic front. And it's also its military budget is bigger than all the next 10 countries put together. Therefore, I think the American weight is still strong. But by looking at American domestic politics, by looking at the craziness that goes on and what goes on in American universities, it's easy to mistake the public crisis in the US to an underestimation of the American power. Those of us old enough, I mean, you remember the Vietnam years. You thought America was falling apart, all the guys smoking pot and having fun, long hair, flowers in the head. You thought America was finished. Within 5 years, 1980, America was back. So I think it's not wise to underestimate American power. And my sense is they still have the capacity. They still have the largest number of allies against China. And above all, they control the financial pipelines. The entire system of finance is run by them. But of course, Russians and the Chinese want to change it. Whether they can actually do it or not is the question.
I cannot but ask you about Trump and the prospects of geopolitically of, let's take it that Trump gets back into the White House. What do you see seriously as the ramifications, if any, of that?
I think the biggest ratifications for itself would be for the US itself. I mean, the kind of things he's saying, actually, media doesn't cover it as much as they should. So he's saying, I'll use the American army to throw out all the illegals who are in the United States. He's saying, I'm going to dismantle the FBI. I'm going to dismantle this whole state apparatus that is hostile to him, because not all of this will happen. But the fact is, he's challenging the fundamentals of American state, the liberal establishment. So in some sense, the fight between Trump and his supporters on the one hand, if they win, and the deep state or the establishment will only get worse. And I think that's going to be a big thing. On trade, which is going to be of even bigger consequence for the rest of the world, 10% tariff on all imports. And to the special friends, China, a 60% tariff, maybe sometimes 100. So you're talking about, actually, he's saying, I'm going to change the rules by which America has traded with the world. Last time, he already did that. But this time, he's going to raise that game. I think this will be of great consequence for the rest of the world. How will the US trade policy evolve? And I think there, the warning signs are pretty grim. And lastly, on the issue of war and peace, he said, look, I'll do a deal with Russia in 24 hours. I'll show it to the Chinese. So it's in a way, in a sense, the madman has more options, right? There's no fear of Biden or Obama, but if you have a madman in the White House, how China and Russia will have to react to him is going to be actually gives him a lot of leverage, which I think he's confident that actually he can force a deal on Ukraine tomorrow.
I think he's a cultivated madman. But
Yeah,
anyhow,
just still.
one last question before we throw it open to the House. And this on this business of strategic autonomy. We pride ourselves on strategic autonomy, as do many other powers, including the EU and France, etc. And this is basically hedging strategic ambiguity. Maybe it's the call of the times. But do you see India being able to continue on the path of strategic autonomy in the foreseeable future? Are we strong enough to do that?
Yeah. No, I think the strategic autonomy, every country has its own mythology, right? I mean, we all tell ourselves stories. Every country has to tell itself, we have this grand policy of strategic autonomy. But saying strategic autonomy is like saying birds fly or fish swim. In a world of 180 sovereigns, every sovereign is trying to maximize its autonomy. So it's not some unique Indian thing the way we make it out to be. And depending on your circumstances, your size, your location, you will get some autonomy and you work with it. For example, Mr. Biden seems to have no autonomy vis-a-vis Israel. He has to send weapons every day and put appear to deliver humanitarian assistance at the same time. So this notion that there's somehow India does this strategic autonomy stuff I think is a myth. It has no basis in reality. In fact, in the name, strategic autonomy was an argument was largely used against the Americans because we didn't like the Americans in the Cold War. So this is keeping distance from the United States. And in the process of claiming strategic autonomy from the Americans, we've locked ourselves into strategic dependence on the Russians, which is 60% of, as you know, all your weapons still come from Russia. Therefore, you actually, in the name of fighting the Americans or resisting American domination, we've ceded ourselves into a Russian primacy on the military side and Chinese primacy on the economic side.
Yeah.
So the strategy today is about winning strategic autonomy from Russia in the military sphere and strategic autonomy from China in the economic sphere. That's the direction we are going.
Well, I'd love to ask him a question on India's strategic neighborhood, but I think we leave it open to the House now. And okay, I see there the first hand.
Bit of an oblique question. Diplomacy is supposed to be a soft power and communicated and discussed in a soft manner. Today we see Indian diplomacy with a lot of chest thumping and strong language. Love to hear your comments on the correctness or the incorrectness of that.
Sorry?
You want to take on one,
Yeah. Look, I think, diplomacy, as you rightly said, things are supposed to be the first line of defense before you get the armies in, before you get others in. You're supposed to do it not only softly, but with great style. If I'm putting a knife into you, I'll say, please, Excellency, please accept my considerations, highest consideration. So that's the way you dealt with it. But I think there are two levels at which I think we have a problem today. I think there is I think the government itself, I would say, is more careful in terms of what it says. But it is the ecosystem in Delhi and the YouTubers, which is ready to slam anybody who criticizes India. This sense of, we have already arrived. We are going to tell the rest of the world what to do. Some of it has been reinforced by the claims of the government. We are arrived. We are a Vishwaguru. We're going to tell the world what to do. But the fact is, we are still at $2,600 per capita income. You might become the third largest economy. You might become a $5 trillion economy. But your per capita income is still barely, not even $3,000. In fact, Bangladesh is slightly higher per capita GDP than us. That tempering of that, look, our challenges are enormous. A lot of it is still internal. But I think there is some being carried away by this notion where India is rising. We've done great stuff. We are doing good stuff on diplomacy. But I think this rhetoric has actually fed into a complacence, an arrogance, a hubris, and some assertiveness, as we've seen in some areas, which is going to create problems. I think we've just seen that beginning to happen on the issue of the assassinations abroad, or of how our neighbors begin to see you. Also, there's dangers of being too arrogant before you are too powerful. So I think.
Any more questions?
A sensitive question. Moderate Islam is in retreat, and radical Islam is rearing its head. In fact, Kuwait just declared an emergency for 4 years, etc. Lots of problems happening in Europe. Do you think in the foreseeable future, can you see a coalition of religions fighting a holy war?
No, I don't, with respect, I don't see moderate Islam as really in retreat. Actually, I would say it's come back in a pretty interesting ways. What Mohammed bin Salman is doing in Saudi Arabia today, the most conservative Islamic society, he's actually doing reforms, which is the big thing. I think for many of us in South Asia, we have almost, South Asia alone, we have 600 million Muslims. But the standard for conservatism was set by what happened in Saudi Arabia. From the late 70s till recently, the conservatism of Saudi Arabia became the standard bearer for everywhere else. When you go to Indonesia, which had a fairly liberal Islam, they all want to emulate the Arabs. But I think the reform in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, the fact that the UAE is allowed to build a temple, Abu Dhabi, they had one before. Pope visited Abu Dhabi. First time Pope set foot on the Arabian soil was when Abu Dhabi, the UAE invited him. The UAE says, look, we have 180 nationalities. I'm into business. I'm not into religion. That if I have to keep this 180, people from 180 countries in my country happy, I need to give them some religious freedom. So I think the logic of economics and business is actually forcing UAE to take a more moderate positions. And Saudis now says, look, if you see Saudi Arabia, what MBS has said 5 years ago, look, we made big mistakes in 1979 by going towards radicalism. But today, we need to correct ourselves. That Saudi Arabia can't rely just on oil. We need to modernize. So I think that is a very powerful message. And it expresses itself on one particular issue I just mentioned. You would think what Israel is doing in Gaza would unite the Arabs, would unite the Muslims. So when in the first month of the conflict, Iran at the OIC, Organization of Islamic Conference, said, let's all break diplomatic ties with Israel. The Saudis said no. So the Abraham Accords, actually, the moderate Islamists, the moderate Sunni regimes in Middle East want to work with Israel. So they want to build a new, peaceful, prosperous Middle East. And the challenge comes from extremist Zionists in Israel, as well as from extremist Islamic groups like in Iran or Hamas or Houthis. That's the tension. So I think for India too, our improved relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for the first time, moderate Islamic regimes are today our best friends in the Middle East. And I think that's a new element that's beginning to emerge.
Well, naval officers are very cognizant of bells, and one has rung somewhere there. So I guess we have reached the end of our show.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.